Now I'm going to discuss the arteries of the brain. The arteries of the brain, actually, they come from two sources, two important sources. The first source is what we call vertebral artery. These vertebral arteries are two, one from the left side of the body and one from the right side of the body. So there are two vertebral arteries coming from the arch of the aorta, and then they come towards the brain before they finally unite. The second important artery is what we call internal carotid artery. These are the two important arteries. So we have two carotid arteries, two vertebral arteries. We have one carotid artery on the internal carotid artery on the right side. We have another one on the left side. So these two internal carotid arteries from either side, they go up, pass underneath the skull, and go into the cranium to supply the brain and other structures within the cranium. Similarly, you have the vertebral arteries coming from the chest. They go up through the neck, through the vertebral foramina, and then they pass into the foramen magnum, and then they finally unite, and then they supply the brain itself. So these are the two important arteries. These ones you are seeing, the basilar artery and the circle of Willis, they are all part of these two arteries. Are you clear? Good. So we have now seen that there are two important arteries that join together to form the, to supply the brain itself. So this is just an architectural view or picture of the vessels that supply the entire brain. So look at the vertebral artery. This is one vertebral artery on one side. This is another vertebral artery. These two vertebral arteries, as they come from the arch of the aorta, the two together unite to form this single artery. This single artery is what we call basilar artery. So the two vertebral arteries from either side, left and the right, they unite at the base of the brain. This is the inferior aspect of the brain, and that is what we call base of the brain. So the two vertebral arteries unite at the inferior border of the pons. I told you that the brainstem consists of the midbrain, which is this one, the pons, which is this one, and the medulla oblongata, which is this one. So the two vertebral arteries unite at the inferior border of the pons. This is the inferior border of the pons. So at the inferior border of the pons, the two vertebral arteries unite to form this basilar artery. Are you clear? After forming the basilar artery gives branches. Even the vertebral arteries, before they unite, they form branches. So again, the two internal carotid arteries, this is the internal carotid artery coming from either side, and then they now, give branches, one anterior and one on the medial side. So it gives rise to branches anteriorly and on either side. And then it also gives another branch posteriorly, So all these are the branches that, of these two important arteries that form this, networking around the base of the brain before they finally go into the substance of the brain and also to supply the surfaces of the brain. This is just to show you the picture there. But actually, this is the actual diagram where you will understand it very well. Are you clear? So if you now look at this diagram, this is one of the vertebral arteries on either side. Each of the vertebral artery, before it unites on either side of each of these two vertebral arteries, it gives a branch, what we call posterior inferior cerebellar artery, what we call PICA, P-I-C-A, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, to supply the posterior inferior part of the cerebellum. Are you clear? So we said that each of these two vertebral arteries, before uniting, each one gives rise to PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, supplying the posterior inferior part of the cerebellum. Are you clear? Good. That is branch from its lateral side of each of this vertebral artery. From its medial side, each of this vertebral artery gives a branch. And the two branches from either side, they unite together to form what we call anterior spinal artery. And that anterior spinal artery supplies the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. Are you clear? So the anterior part of the spinal cord receives its own blood supply from two branches. Each of these branches comes up from the medial side of each of the vertebral arteries. So the two branches now unite to form a single artery known as anterior spinal artery, and it descends down to supply the anterior part of the spinal cord. So the two vertebral arteries, after giving these two important branches, they ascend up. By the time they reach the base of the pons, they unite so that they form this large branch which is known as basilar artery. From the basilar artery, immediately after forming the basilar artery gives one branch. The first branch from the basilar artery is what we call ica. We have pica, now we have ica, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Are you clear? This anterior inferior cerebellar artery is the first branch of the basilar artery. That one supplies the anterior inferior aspect of the cerebellum. Are you clear? That means the inferior aspect of the cerebellum is being supplied by both pica and ica. Clear? Good. So the second branch coming from the basilar artery is what we call labyrinthine branches or labyrinthine branch. That labyrinthine is supplied to the internal ear. You know, ear is divided into three compartments: external ear, middle ear, and internal ear. So the internal ear is being supplied by this second branch from the basilar artery. That is what we call labyrinthine artery. Are you clear? So we have labyrinthine artery supplying the internal ear, and so other branches coming from the basilar artery are what we call pontine arteries. These pontine arteries, they go into the substance of the pons to supply the structures within the pons and outside the pons. Because inside the pons there are various nuclei. Nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, nuclei of the facial nerve, abducent nerve, vestibulocochlear nuclei, and so on and so forth. They are all located within the pons. When we do the brainstem, you will see all these nuclei coming from each part of this brain stem. So now we've seen that pontine branches supply the substance of the pons. So these are the third branches coming from the basilar artery. Another important branch coming is what you call superior cerebellar artery. Superior cerebellar artery supplies the superior part of the cerebellum. You remember we said that the inferior part of the cerebellum is being supplied by two arteries, pica and ica. And the superior part is being supplied by superior cerebellar artery. Are you clear? So after giving rise to this superior cerebellar artery, the basilar artery terminates in two branches, what we call posterior cerebral arteries. These posterior cerebral arteries, these ones, they supply the posterior part of each of the cerebral hemispheres. You can remember we said that each cerebral hemisphere has frontal part, parietal part, and posterior part. That is the occipital portion. Are you clear? So the occipital portion of the cerebral hemisphere is being supplied by these posterior cerebral arteries, which are the terminal branches of the basilar artery. Are you all clear? Good. So now these are the branches coming from the basilar artery, and we know that basilar artery is from the two vertebral arteries. Remember I said that other branches coming to supply the brain are two important arteries, what we call internal carotid arteries. You remember, I don't know, you have not done head and neck yet. In the heart, you know, the arch of the aorta, you must have done that in the thorax. You know, we have what we call common carotid artery. Are you clear? Common carotid artery from the left-hand side comes from where? from the brachiocephalic trunk. Are you clear? Brachiocephalic trunk, if you can remember, is a large trunk coming from the arch of the aorta that bifurcates into two to give rise to the subclavian artery supplying the left upper limb, and then the common carotid artery ascending up. Are you clear? This common carotid artery divides on the left side, to give rise to, sorry, to the right side, not left, to the right side, to give rise to the internal and external carotid artery. So on the left-hand side, you get it, the common carotid artery comes separately from the arch of the aorta. You get my point? While on the right side, the common carotid artery comes from the brachiocephalic trunk. On the left-hand side, it comes directly from the arch of the aorta. So the two together ascend up until they reach the level of the cervical region, around the level of C6, they bifurcate into internal and external carotid artery. The internal carotid artery has no branch whatsoever in the neck. It has no single branch in the neck. So it passes at the base of the skull through what you call carotid canal to enter into the cranium. And then once it comes into the cranium, it divides into three branches. One anteriorly, what is known as anterior cerebral artery. You get my point? And the other one is what we call posterior communicating artery. So the internal carotid artery gives rise to two major branches. One going anteriorly, what is known as anterior cerebral artery, and then there is another one, what is known as posterior communicating artery. That posterior communicating branch communicates with the posterior cerebral artery, which is terminal branch of the basilar artery. Are you clear? And the internal carotid artery continues as middle cerebral artery. Did you hear the English clear? The internal carotid artery gives two branches. One anteriorly known as anterior cerebral artery, one posteriorly known as posterior communicating artery. And then the main artery continues as middle cerebral artery. So the anterior cerebral artery supplies the medial surface of each of the cerebral hemisphere. Remember, I told you that each of the cerebral hemispheres has about 4 surfaces: superior lateral surface, medial surface, and inferior surface. Remember, I said the inferior surface is further subdivided into orbital surface and tentorial. Good. So now, the medial surface of each of the cerebral hemisphere is being supplied by this anterior cerebral artery. Are you clear? The posterior part of each of the cerebral hemisphere is being supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So we are only left with the superior lateral surface, which is being supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Are you clear? So the superior lateral surface is being supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Medial surface by anterior cerebral artery. Are you clear? And then the posterior surface is being supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So someone will now ask, what happens to the inferior surface? So the inferior surface is a combination of 2 arteries. One artery from the posterior cerebral artery, after supplying the posterior part, it also supplies some part of the posterior medial part of the cerebral hemisphere, and also posterior inferior aspect of the tentorial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. While the anterior cerebral artery, this one, after supplying the medial surface, it supplies some portion of the orbital surface of the inferior surface of each of the cerebral hemisphere. Are you clear? Good. So if we now go back to this slide here, you will see that this is anterior cerebral artery. After supplying the medial surface, these are the branches supplying the orbital surface here. Are you clear? And even the middle cerebral artery, after supplying the superior lateral surface, some of it also supplies the orbital surface of the... So it's like the orbital surface is supplied by both the anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery. If you now look at the posterior, the temporal surface of, is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery and some portion of the middle cerebral artery. So this combination of arteries now supply the inferior surface. Are you all clear? These are the blood supply of the cerebral hemispheres. If you look at this, there is something like a cycle here formed. This cycle is completed between these two cerebral arteries. This is one anterior cerebral artery, this is another anterior cerebral artery. So the two together are combined, are joined together, or they are connected together by what we call anterior communicating artery. Remember, we have posterior communicating branches coming from the internal carotid artery. The anterior communicating artery or branch connects the two anterior cerebral arteries. Are you clear? So that the cycle is being completed. This is what we call arterial cycle of Willis. Are you clear? So now we have this arterial cycle of Willis. So this cycle is important in that if one artery is blocked, there is compensation from the other side. Let me give you a typical example. Supposing that this anterior cerebral artery of this side is blocked. Are you clear? So now the artery, the artery, if this one is blocked, so you can see that arteries can go, the blood can go from this artery, go to this side, and then supply other part. So similarly, if you have a blockage, for example, now this posterior communicating artery is blocked to go and supply the posterior, because this one add up to the supply to the posterior cerebral artery. Are you clear? So if this one is blocked, this internal carotid artery from this side, the blood will gravitate down here, go to this side, and come to this side. Are you clear? So it's like there is a little bit of compensation. If one artery is being blocked, the other ones will now compensate. But then actually, the anastomosis between these arteries is not as good as in other places in the human part of the body. That is why actually, once you have a blockage in any of these arteries, at times we have this stroke developing. Are you clear? Aha. So now we've seen this arterial cycle of Willis. So you check my videos regarding internal anatomy of, clinical anatomy of the neuroanatomy. You will see some of this clinical anatomy of this cycle of Willis and other things like that. So now this is just to show you the branches of the anterior cerebral arteries and the posterior cerebral arteries and the branches supplying the cerebellum, so which I've already discussed. So this is the superior lateral surface. These are the branches of the middle cerebral artery supplying one of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and this is the medial surface, and so this is the anterior cerebral artery supplying the medial surface. This was what I was telling you, that the posterior cerebral artery, after supplying the posterior surface of the occipital lobe, it also supplies some of the medial surface of the posterior part of the cerebral hemisphere, including the inferior aspect. So these are the areas of supply of both the anterior and the posterior cerebral artery. So this is just to discuss the meninges. Let us just have a break, and if you want if you want to ask any question, you ask before I finally continue. So let us just have a break of 1 or 2 minutes.